Once again, a warm welcome and a very good morning to all our dear participants. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Sunayani Bhattacharya with us. Dr. Bhattacharya is the Associate Professor of English, St. Mary's College of California. Today, she will give a talk on a wireless world, radio, and the domestic space in early 20th century Bengal. We are truly delighted to have you with us, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the very generous introduction. I do have a slide, and let me see if I can make sure I did check that it works. Um, okay. Could you let me know if you can see it?
Not yet, not yet. Yeah. We can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a little disorientating for me to actually be presenting to you at Lady Brabourne because my parents' home is down the street behind Don Bosco, and I grew up. My mama bari is further down CIT Road next to Holy Child School. I went to Pratt Memorial. So walking in front of Lady Brabourne was always very much a fixture in my life. So there's a certain sense of disjuncture in presenting to you from Oakland, where it's kind of 10:30 at night. But I want us to hold on to this sense of disjuncture for several reasons, not least of all because this feeling of being a little bit out of place and out of time is actually very central to the story of radio listenership, particularly during the early decades of the 20th century. So essentially, radio played with one's sense of time and place and allowed one to sort of be at a place, be at multiple different places, right, at the same time. And in many ways, radio played on the same sort of level as the newspaper, right, in kind of fashioning a world that Benedict Anderson calls shackled by the clock and the calendar, right? That you have to be at a certain place at a certain time, and you're sort of required to discipline your body to be there. And being there at that place and at that time allows you to then escape the confines of your room, of your location. And this sort of sense of being tied to a time and place is actually something that we're losing, given our reliance on, say, podcasts or streaming shows, right? We're no longer that tied to a place and a time in order to receive our entertainment visually or orally. So there's a certain way in which then a radio is playing on one sense of time and place. At the same time, again, following Anderson, it's also playing on one sense of community. So you're listening to radio by yourself, but you are imagining yourself in community with a huge group of people, right? So imagine, for example, the sound of talk at the start of Mohishashramurdini on Mahalaya, or the sort of where you're huddled and you're listening to the radio on your own in your room, but you can hear your neighbor's radio and you can hear their neighbor's radios, right? So it's that sense of you are there alone, but you're not. And one of the best examples of this perhaps is from if you remember the film Diyanaya, there is a scene where the young heroine played by Tanuja is sort of, laying on her bed, and it's very this dreamy, idyllic moment, and she's listening to a song on the radio, and she's sort of, imagining this her beloved on the radio, and she doesn't know yet, right, that the voice of Uttam Kumar, it's the same person who's their newly hired uh, driver, Hriday Horan. But for her, it's a very intimate, very personal moment because she believes that, and the camera leads us to believe that she is, or he's singing for her. And at the same time, we know that that is not the case, right? Because this is being heard by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And shortly after the song ends, she rushes to the telephone, yet another medium connecting distances, with her friend to call the radio station and ask if she can come in to see the singer. And at which point she's told that, oh, they weren't even, it wasn't even a live performance. They were simply replaying a recorded version of the song. So there are several layers of disjunction happening over here. But what's happening in that scene is that we get this sense that the young woman is allowed to sort of transgress the boundaries of her room, and she's able to imagine herself in communion, in conversation with a man outside of parental control, right? And the only technology that kind of comes close to this is the novel, which again, in the mid-19th century, allows women a very similar access. So here again, I'm thinking of the scene from something like Shrutijit Ray's Charulata, where Charu is sitting on her bed. She's reading, or at least next to her, she has a novel by Bankim Chandra, and she's weaving these slippers for her brother-in-law with whom she's in love. And that is an illicit love, right? And this entire sequence is sort of guided by the fact that she can be alone in her room and imagine a relationship with another man, which is sort of, brought on by the fact that she has that time and space created by the novel, right? So the novel and the radio in this case are functioning on fairly similar, a similar sort of, what is it called? Registers, as it were. Let me see if I can sort of move through this. There we go. Okay, so what I have here are just a few examples of very early radio and kind of vintage radio sets, and we'll be talking through some of them. But in what follows, I want to tell you three stories from early days of radio, not just in Bengal, but kind of in Eastern India. I'll go as far as Lucknow. But I want to place this story on three pillars, as it were. The first of these pillars is a disjuncture between the embodied and the disembodied, right? This sort of sense of confusion almost that is brought on by a disembodied voice that is emanating from a radio set. And at the same time, it is being heard by an embodied creature, and we know that it is coming from someone who occupies space in the world. So that's the first. The second is, of course, this ability of women to transgress that technology grants them. And here, women, I'm thinking predominantly in terms of listenership or audiences, but also performers. And then finally, in amidst all of this, the third pillar is a creation of a sort of newly modernizing domestic space, right? A lot is happening over here, some of which I will touch on, but it is important for us to remember that the radio is penetrating the Bengali home, and that's what this story is really about. So before going into, I'm going to give you a very brief history of radio in India, and radio technology made its way into India in the first decade of the 20th century, but it wasn't until June 1923 that the first ever public broadcast was made by the Bombay Radio Club. It was a private club of radio enthusiasts. About 5 months later, the Calcutta Radio Club came into being, followed by the privately owned India Broadcasting Company, which actually goes under about 3 years after it is set up, which is then actually followed by the British colonial government establishing the Indian Broadcasting Service in 1930. To say that a radio had a rocky start in India would be an understatement. From the very start, the medium is plagued by infrastructural challenges. There's not enough towers. There are not enough radio sets to begin with initially. The tubes that are necessary for early radios to function were very costly to replace. So you have layers and layers of sort of infrastructural challenges. Coupled with this, of course, you have a battle between commercial ventures and government interests. And it's nowhere is it more visible than when we are talking about licenses. So in order to listen to radio, it's almost like paying for a service, right? Even for streaming services today, we would pay. So it's similar. You had to buy a license in order to listen to radio. And Beta Jagat, which was the mouthpiece of the Calcutta radio station, frequently published pieces that kind of likened listening to radio without a license to stealing your neighbor's things, right? It's seen as not just a crime, but somehow ethically very problematic. So you have infrastructural challenges, you have these sort of, commercial ventures, government strictures, the problems there. And then, of course, there's a sheer diversity of India's population, right? And catering to them and devising shows for them becomes a huge challenge. And now this is not unique to India. You see this happening particularly in North America, both in Canada and the US. But in India, there's an added complication, and that is language. So, for example, one of the first challenges that the CRS of the Calcutta radio station has to face is deciding on the number of languages in which the news bulletins would be broadcast, right? It was given that it would be broadcast in English and in Bengali, but then there were very strong cases made for Hindi, Urdu, Odia, to some extent even Marathi, strangely or not so strangely enough, because the argument was that there are there's a sizable population speaking these languages living in the regions served by CRS. So naturally, the languages should be incorporated in at least the news. Now, this became, not viable both commercially and also in terms of program logistics. And so news was broadcast only in Bengali and English, and sometimes in Hindi. But this was not without its intentions, right? So you can start to see all of the problems in even coming up with radio programs, let alone sort of transmitting the programs. And to add to all of this, you have the very particular problem of the rise of Indian nationalist movement in the 1920s, which adds another obstacle as the colonial government imposed increasingly stringent anti-sedition laws which censored every form of public media, and radio was no exception, right? And particularly because radio was state-sponsored, nothing political could be ever said on it. And yet there was audience demand for political discussion, political news. I'm talking about the 1940s when the Second World War is on. And yet Indian radio, when it's broadcasting politics, it has to be very much within the bounds of what is allowed, initially at least, by the colonial government. And so, the programming has to sort of sidestep this or find ways around it and not turn bland, because the moment you turn bland, you lose your audience. So radio also has to ensure that it is attractive enough. However, despite all of these challenges, the number and variety of radio programs being broadcast on CRS alone doubled between 1930 and 1939, with additional time slots being created for popular broadcasts such as the Daily News Report and talk shows for specific sections of the listening public. So when the Indian Broadcasting Company, IBC, goes under in February 1930, and the existence of radio as a medium is threatened in India, listeners actually step in to offer to pay astronomical sums. There are people who offer to pay 5,000 rupees at that time in the 1930s. And they signed petitions to Lord Willingdon, who was the Governor General at that point of time, by the thousands. And this compels the colonial government to step in and, as I mentioned earlier, they turn a commercial venture into a government venture, and they make Indian Broadcasting Company a government venture. So this information about people writing in and offering to pay money is published in Betar Jagat, which documents an audience that took to radio from its very inception, demanding more programs, while also requiring that broadcast times accommodate their increasingly modernized lives. And here it's actually interesting to think about two things. The first is that radio is initially seen, like the novel, it's actually seen initially as a medium that must cater to women. And, if it can do so, if it can capture the female market, then people would, then radio will take off. And so you have a host of these shows that are designed for women, most notably, of course, Mohila Mujlish, which I'll talk about in a minute. But of course, you also have shows such as Chotoder Boitok, from which you get the very famous Golpo Dadur Ashur, Biddati Mondol, and these two cater to children and young adolescents up to, supposedly up to sort of college-going age. And then Mohila Mujlish, which aims to sort of capture the women audience. But the popularity of these shows can be gauged by the frequency with which they appear in Betar Jagat's editorial column, which is called Amader Kotha. In 1940 alone, Amader Kotha devotes at least half a column space for each of these three programs every month, often incorporating letters from audiences to justify production decisions as to what kinds of topics would be included, who would be invited as guest speakers, and who would be the show's ideal listeners, right? There's a little bit of a tussle between, is Chotoder Boitok meant only for the young, or should it incorporate their parents as well? And Betar Jagat writes back and says no, and there's this kind of back and forth. And this is happening every issue almost, right? The Beta Jagat comes out bi-weekly. Um, and let me sort of transition to the two here. So you can see to your left is an issue of Beta Jagat, and to your right is Nabashakti, and I'll talk about Nabashakti in a minute. But so there is audience pressure to say, for example, turn Mohila Mujlish into a show that runs not for 30 minutes, but for an hour. So initially it ran from 2 to 2:30, but then that was pushed to 2 to 3 when Prabhupada Boitak would take over, and then you'd have that be repeated. So, all of these programming decisions are actually being made by audiences who want to listen to radio and who want to listen to more radio. Um, and there's also a demand for live classical music, and I'll talk about that as well. Although this is interesting because the definition of what is classical remains contested. 30s and 40s, we get a variety of musical performances, but then by the 50s, when you have someone like B.V. Kester come in, the Information and Broadcasting Minister of newly independent India, there's a clamping down on what classical means. And there are sort of, very ideological, political reasons for that. So in what follows then, I want to share with you 3 case studies from the early days of radio in Eastern India that help us understand this world of radio audiences who were so invested in radio. And each story juxtaposes radio, its female listeners, and a domestic space as intimate yet public. Right? There's that sort of paradox present there. And for all 3, I look at radio broadcasts as refracted on the pages of Pita Jagat and Nabashakti, which was a popular Bengali newspaper that ran until the 50s, 60s. It continued after that, but in different guises. And Beta Jagat continued well into the 80s, at which point it was discontinued. So for me, what threads these stories together is the soundscape they create. And following sound historians, I think of soundscape as an auditory landscape, which comprises both the sounds that are emanating from the radio sets, but also ways of comprehending those sounds, right? So essentially, the problem that I'm trying to tackle here is that while All India Radio has a very, very comprehensive archive, the shows that I'm interested in, the talk shows, the sort of daily, everyday quotidian shows, are never recorded. You have recordings of classical musical performances, sort of watershed speeches. You have 3 recordings of Mahishasura by Virendra Krishna Bhadra, but the vast majority of those performances are not recorded. And so there is no real way for us to hear what these shows sounded like. What did Mohila Mujlish sound like? Unless, we know someone, and that pool is becoming increasingly small, unless we know someone who heard these shows, we can't really sort of fathom what the actual sound quality, what the sound was like. And so Soundscape then offers us a way of sort of capturing the ghost in the middle of the room, as it were, by throwing sheets on it and seeing the shape that it takes. And some of these sheets are the 2 newspaper or the journals that I'm looking at, so letters and editorials that are printed. Alongside that, looking at anecdotal evidence. Alongside that, looking at the sort of radio technology that was available, and sort of piecing all of these to get a sense of the actual sound, and then to understand how people made sense of this sound. Because keep in mind, radio is very, very new in the 1930s. So people not only have to get used to the contraption, but they also have to learn to understand. So for example, there's this, this is about, how radio shows are timed. But for me, what's actually interesting is this particular moment where audiences are complaining that the pace of discussion is too fast, and they cannot take down recipes, for example. And so they need those recipes reprinted somewhere so that they can go back to it. Now, for us today in the 21st century, this makes sense. We have maybe some of us, I might be sort of, showing my age here, but, if you remember Sanjeev Kapoor's Khana Khazana from the early 90s, you would sort of, rush to take down all of the recipes, and then there was no way of pausing, and there was no way of actually recording that live television, right? So this keeping pace with what is being cast at you is difficult. And so, but that tells us a little bit about what the sound must have been like, that they were speaking at a colloquial pace. They were not necessarily stopping and pausing, but also that transmission perhaps was not always clear. So there might have been, noise disturbances. So all of these elements come together in what I'm calling a soundscape. Right, and to sort of get at that soundscape, then these three stories. The first of which actually begins not with sound, but with the moving image. So in August 1931, the film reviewer for Nabashukti, who wrote under the pseudonym of Chandrasekhar, commented on a relatively bland film produced by Unique Pictures called Choop. And this seemingly inconsequential film, however, had profound implications for radio audiences in Bengal, particularly for women who were regular listeners of Mohila Mojlish. And one of the reasons behind the popularity of Mohila Mojlish was the voice of its host, Birendra Krishna Bhadra, who sounded so stately and mature that most of his listeners automatically assumed that he was a proro or an elderly man. And I'm quoting from letters that are published in Ajkal, Nabushukti, and Beta Jagat. So although Bhadra had begun his performance career on stage, so on the visual medium, by the early 1930s he had transitioned almost entirely to radio, right? So to the oral medium, and therefore he had become almost entirely a disembodied voice. Thus, the measured quality of his speech, coupled with CRS's emphasis on an exceedingly formal version of Bengali, lent a degree of propriety to Mohila Mojlish. And what I want you to imagine is a world in which people didn't really know who Birendra Krishna Bhadra was or what he looked like. And they just heard him and assumed that he was an elderly man because of the way he spoke. Yet when Choop was released, audiences quickly noticed in its cast of characters a certain Birendra Krishna Bhadra, who appeared not old and stately, but rather young and attractive. And so this was the man they saw in Choop. And this led to a major controversy. And I'm not going to go into the details or too much of the controversy, because that's brilliantly documented by Indira Vishwash in her Making of a Radio program. But what's worth noting here is that there was a section of the audience, and this is predominantly women writing in, but also men. There's a section of the audience of Mohila Mojlish who attacked the producers of the show for a breach of etiquette in allowing a young woman or in allowing a young man to not only spend hours talking to women, but also have access to their private thoughts via letters that they sent to Mohila Mojlish. So they were outraged. How could you leave a group of women, vulnerable as they are, in the hands of a man who's this young, and then he has access to all of their thoughts and their ambitions and desires, even though the letters were very, very formal for the most part. And on the other hand, Bhadra had a solid group of defenders who rallied hard and not only praised him for his somber quality of his voice, but went so far as to accuse the opposition of casting aspersions on their Pitritullo, or father like Vishnu Sharma, which was Bhadra's stage name. So what I find fascinating here is the ease with which the lines between a disembodied voice transmitted over a radio set and the physical body from which this voice emanates, and the domestic space inhabited by women listening to Mohila Mojlish cross each other. The impassioned rhetoric employed by all participating in the controversy, radio audiences, station directors, producers, Betar Jagat and Nabushukti editors and reviewers, the sort of degree to which they are invested in this conversation suggests that at least in the early years of radio in Bengal, the relationship between the broadcasting voice and its audience is difficult to parse. Should women be chaperoned even in the presence of a voice that is coming out of a mechanical set is a question as much about policing of women's bodies as it is about the nature of sound. How does one categorize the physicality of a sound that comes out of radio and yet is intimately connected to the body which utters it? How does one, or should one, think about preserving the sanctity of the domestic space from the intrusion of sounds emanating from CRS's headquarters at number 1 Garston Place? For me, Mohila Mojlish is integral to the soundscape of Bengali radio precisely because it telescopes the problem of embodiment with such clarity, even as it allows us to actually hear how radio voices sounded to its early listeners. As we read the protracted exchanges between participants, between supporters and of Bhadro and his accusers, we begin to hear Bhadro's sonorous voice informing his listeners that last week's program inspired one audience member to share her homemade recipe for hair gel, which they should go and read in Bekar Jagat. So there's a very close relationship between the print and the and radio. By looking closely at the words on the printed page, we begin to get a sense of what the listeners of Mohila Mojlish heard. The word Pitritullo, for example, had little to do with with how Bhadro looked, but was founded in what he sounded like. Similarly, the fact that he sounded and looked different tells us a lot about audience expectations. So looking at this moment from almost a century away, we are left with traces of sound that reach us from these printed conversations and tell us that the pitch and timbre of Bhadro's voice, along with the pace of his speech, created a vast audience that that cared as much, if not more, for the voice and the content. So while this first story is very well documented, I want us to, and this is an example of some of these letters, and they make for fascinating reading. My next story is almost entirely anecdotal, and it comes from several accounts, a lot of oral history here. Most recently, Saba Dewan's Tawaif Nama, in which he records the oral history of a family of Tawaifs or courtesan singers who had their kothas in Benares. So these women originally came from Bihar, but they migrated to Benares because that was the sort of classical musical center. So However, till well into the middle of the 20th century, the Lucknow radio station had two separate entrances, one in the front for respectable performers, and another concealed in the rear for those deemed to be from less reputable sections of society, such as the wives. While this may have been the case also in other northern Indian radio stations, Lucknow station managers were particularly concerned with the need to segregate performers given their proximity to Benares, which was one of the cities best known for its Dawai performers. So essentially what happened was that, you had the Allahabad station as well, but Lucknow was bigger and it had more of an infrastructure and could attract these singers from Benares who would, come over to the city, stay overnight, perform, and then leave, right? So it was a short enough distance. At this juncture, it is worth noting that both the gramophone and the radio were instrumental in vastly expanding the reach of classical Indian music, as they offered the wife performers a significant avenue of livelihood, even as the social currency of courtesans rapidly declined. So, with the coming of the British, a number of things happened that changed the sort of moral fabric and kind of Victorianize Indian society, and it leads to the wives falling from grace, right? They become criminalized, they become associated with prostitution, and they lose their sort of, quota livelihood, their live performances, which they depended on. And so they transition to the gramophone and to radio, notably in technology that sort of, takes away their body but leaves their voice, right? That allows audiences to sort of get a purified version of, say, someone like Begum Akhtar or Rasulan Bai singing without having to present themselves at a quota. So there are some very interesting things happening there. So regardless of their popularity and musical prowess, singers of such caliber as Rasulan Bai and Attari Bai, and I have two fairly rare images over here. The first is of, to the left is Begum Akhtar performing at All India Radio Lahore. And then you have Rasulan Bai recording a performance. Most likely it is a Tumri, but it's one of the rare images that we have of her actually being recorded, or her being visually recorded as she's being, her performance is also being recorded. So, singers today, we accept them as sort of, doyens of classical music, but even they had to enter through the less conspicuous entrance at the Lucknow station, lest they crossed paths with the middle and upper class performers and station employees. The process of segregation continued on air as the wives were both listed on programs and introduced as professionals, alerting listeners that these were women who made their living by performing in public, unlike their amateur counterparts who presumably sang for aesthetic or educational purposes alone. So, while to a great extent, these methods of isolating performers reflected the morality drives of a newly independent India, as I was mentioning, you have the conservative tendencies of B.V. Keskar during the early 1950s and 60s. They also crucially highlight a fear central to radio technology itself, which is the inability to connect a voice to a body. The allure of the disembodied voice penetrating private and public spaces via the radio set is counterbalanced by the anxiety of precisely such a phenomenon. How does one control not only what the audience is listening to, but the voice that is broadcasting that content, right? So, for example, Keskar clamps down on Bollywood music from being played on radio, and yet you have ways around it, right? That content is now delivered via Radio Ceylon, for example, but also the sort of, purified music that is seen as that is presented as classical music. Keskar has to go through, and his those that come after him have to go through a lot of hoops to make sure that they get the right people singing, right? So the inability to control the body from which this sound is emanating, particularly the female body from which the sound is emanating, is kind of is a bugbear for radio. So the early years of Indian radio shows that the problem is further compounded by audience preferences. So even though the state is trying to clamp down on this, audiences actually prefer listening to singers such as Begum Akhtar or Rasulan Bai, right? And despite the best efforts of program officers and policymakers, audiences make clear their choices. And more often than not, they choose the very same socially unacceptable voices that they are being carefully screened from. And the final story that I want to share with you today comes from an ad that is published in November 16, 1938 in Bidar Jagat. And it is an ad for the Pi model, which is a British radio first introduced in the early 1920s. And the ad, as you can see, features a married couple, and that is identified both by the woman wearing a ghomta or a head covering, but also addressing the man in the image as Ogoshuncho, right? The quintessential Bengali name for the name that the husband has, right? And we are sort of, told by her, and that's who the speech bubble, the woman is the one speaking here. She suggests that her husband exchanged their radio set, their existing radio set, because it can only relay transmissions from the Calcutta radio station. So she says, "Ogo shuncho, আমাদের এই রেডিওটা বদলে ফেলো না, এতে এতে খালি কলকাতা ছাড়া আর কিছু পাওয়া যায় না। পাশের বাড়ির ওরা একটা নতুন পাই রেডিও কিনেছে। তাতে কলকাতা ছাড়া বোম্বাই, দিল্লি, লখনৌ, লাহোর, মাদ্রাজ, এমনকি বিলেত, জার্মানি ইত্যাদি স্পষ্ট শোনা যায়। আর আওয়াজও ভারী চমৎকার, right? So that's the text in Bangla, and in sort of roughly translating that is where she says, please exchange our existing radio set because it can only relay transmissions from the Calcutta radio station. Their neighbors, she informs him, have bought the Pi model, which allows them to tune into stations as far away as Bombay, Delhi, Lucknow, Lahore, Madras, and even European ones such as German radio stations. Outside the speech bubble, we are told that while the sets are made in England, they're designed for Indian climates. And then the ad lists some of the frequencies that can be picked up by the set and ends with the note that one can even add one's gramophone to it, so you can create a sound system, right? You might have heard your grandparents talking about picking up faraway radio stations, parents, grandparents. So for example, one of my colleagues here at St. Mary's told me quite excitedly that in the 50s, as a radio connoisseur living in Northern California, he could pick up the Calcutta radio station while tuning in from Humboldt, right? So this idea or the fascination with radio's ability to transcend great distances, a feature that it shared with the telegraph and then the telephone, has always been part of both the allure and the anxiety surrounding the medium. On the one hand, there's the desire to hear sounds coming from great geographical distances, to experience in some measure a faraway world. On the other hand, the same possibility turns into a threat because the state, again, cannot control the stations the listeners are tuning into. So Isabel Alonso, in her work Radio for the Millions, she notes that the reality was that many in India might have been tuning into Subhash Bose's broadcasts from Germany during the Second World War. And this made AIR officials paranoid enough to transcribe every word they heard on any channel that remotely sounded like it could be in favor of Netaji, or it could be Netaji speaking, whether or not they were from Germany. You know, sometimes they were from different parts of India, Punjab, notably, but often sort of, very close to where they were. And they put in a great deal of effort to censor the radio stations, but it was practically impossible to do. Right? People wanted to and kept sort of tuning into forbidden stations, as it were. The ad for Pi Radio is eerily poignant, coming as it does less than a year before the Second World War starts, right? This is from 1938 in November. The war starts in September 39. And because at this point, when the ad is being presented, the desire to hear sounds from Germany is not yet a politically suspicious one, right? It is merely an expression of interest. What is curious, however, is the way in which the ad frames this interest. The words are spoken not by the man wishing to broaden his wife's world, but rather by the woman. And, again, think about the image of, say, something like Ghore Baire, where you have Bimala being introduced to the world, right, by her husband, Nikhil. That's not happening over here, right? It's not the man saying, "Amader radiota kharap hoye geche," but rather it's the woman saying that, you should go out and get something that expands our horizons. And moreover, her point of comparison are her neighbors. And in this, there's something very intimate about the phrase in Bengali, "Pasher barir ora." Right? It is a mundane turn of phrase, one which is indicative of the speaker's familiarity with the comings and goings in her neighbor's homes. So as one reads the words, an image of a parar kakima or mashima, neighborhood auntie, although translating it as such robs the words of their intimacy. An image of this kakima or mashima comparing her own appliances with those of her neighbors, comparing her own, sort of home's architecture, and seeing whether, we have a bigger balcony or not. This quotidian existence being compared, that's the image that that is conjured by this ad. So superficially, she's far from being transgressive, right? And she's nowhere as near as transgressive, apparently, as the listeners of Muila Mujlish who are defending Bhadru, or the Tawayibs who are singing on the Lucknow station. And yet I would claim that this figment of some ad writer's imagination is no less subversive, because she, like her novel reading predecessors, she wants to bring the world into her home, hence the Ghore Baire reference. Right? She wants to step outside the confines of her Andur Mahol by refashioning the boundaries of that very space. So it's not just enough for her to step outside, she wants to bring the outside into her world. In placing the words in the woman's mouth, the ad gives women both the permission to participate in a cosmopolitan world, as well as to open up her living room to invite these foreign voices in. So I want to conclude by saying that each of these stories that I've mentioned today gives us a glimpse into what radio might have sounded like in early 20th century Bengal and Eastern India, broadly speaking. Um, the preference for certain voices and kinds of music and the conviction with which these tastes are articulated demonstrate that the first generation of radio listeners in the region were invested in exploring the limits of the medium. As they learned how to listen to the radio, they also engaged in shaping what radio actually sounded like. With the listeners transformed the domestic space from which they tuned into shows. So one thing that might be worth noting here is that there is a general elevation of the Bengali home, right, as it becomes modernized. We notice this in the kitchen, where women go from working on the floor with their motis to having a stove and having countertops, right? This gradual elevation is happening in the living room as well, where the bookcase, which used to serve as the focal point of the modern Bengali household at the turn of the 20th century, gradually shifts to make room for radio sets, even as these sets grow smaller and make their way into the inner recesses of their homes. So by the time if you compare ads for radios from the 1930s to early 1930s to the late 1930s, you have the move from very bulky radio sets that would have taken up, that were like cabinets or almaris, to something that was smaller and portable, so it could move deeper into the home, right? So the soundscape which the listener inhabited stayed remarkably stable till the popularization of television and the visual medium in the 1980s, indexing the extent to which radio technology influenced the modern Bengali experience. Thank you so much. And I think I could stop sharing, and happy to answer questions or go whichever way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhattacharya, for such a lucid and such a, giving us such a lucid narrative on the different aspects of radio. I am sure our participants will have some some take on it. I now open the floor for interaction, please. Any questions? Any valued comments?
It's hard sometimes to transition from listening to speaking, even as I talk about a medium that's all about listening.
But the narratives, as you have rightly put up, Virendra Krishna Bhadro through to Subhash Chandra Bose's narratives, these are such a part of the history, that these technologies which are now not so part of our modern technology, and how they have played such a pivotal role in in crafting the not only the gendering of the then women, but also in crafting the in crafting the memoirs of the histories and even the Bengali intelligentsia during that time. It's really such a it's so much enlightening to listen, and it's so fascinating, I must add on, because these are those aspects which we actually really don't take regard of when we think of radio, as a very significant part of mass media. So though it's not such not so much viable in today's time, but you know still in now again we have like Man Ki Baat and all these things, it's just coming up.
Mhm.
But now somehow or the other, these things do hold such, it's not just a past or a bygone era. I still feel though we are in this very much part in this digital platform, but it's not the bygone era. Yeah, we have got a valued comment over here. Someone is really appreciating. Stacy has something. Uh,
Also, may
Daisy,
I just Daisy and
Yeah,
I went, we go back a long way. Daisy, sorry if I'm outing you. We were at Pratt together, and then we lived fairly close by and briefly crossed paths at Jadavpur. So it's really, really lovely to see her here.
yeah. She's just telling that her great grandmother was addicted to sports commentary on the radio. This would be sometime in late 1930s. So yes, definitely. It allowed her to access to the sports. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and if I may actually just add to that and say something about, you mentioned gendering. This is super important over here because the very fact that both that she was allowed to listen to radio or sports commentary, and that we have absolutely no access to what this might have sounded like, right? There's a gendering of the archive as well that's happening that, we are left to, if you're a sound historian working on kind of talk shows and sports, and cricket is one of those areas that I'm looking at as well. And what's happening is that you're left to look through letters and memoirs and the sort of the lesser documents, right? Sometimes policy as well, but you don't have these grand archives. And this is why I keep going back to the novel, because at the same time, when you're trying to figure out how did people read novels, again, there are no traces except in these sort of gendered feminine sections of the archive. I think somebody is asking about, sorry, I don't know. Do you want to moderate the questions or should I? I don't want to jump in.
Please continue. There are other comments as well. You can just go through that if you liked, obviously. Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and definitely, she wouldn't have been allowed to visit any sports stadium unless, you have very, very sort of para games in which it's very chaperoned. Um, but, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm sorry to intervene. I guess there is a question raised by Aparna Singh. She just wanted to know if there were women presenting radio talk shows. Would you please clarify on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And great question there, because there were, and Mohila Mojlish is actually one of the first. So while Birendra Krishna Bhatta kind of weathers the storm initially, he continues to be the presenter for Mohila Mojlish. But the sort of traces of the controversy never leave, and so he finally gives up. And he's replaced by Bela De, who runs the show for a very long time. And so between Leela Mojumdar and who was actually, I think, for a significant period of time, station director as well, and Bela De, they are the ones who women hear on Mohila Mojlish, but also on other talk shows. Predominantly on shows that were aimed at women and children. You did have, in independent India, you did have or actually pre-independent India as well, talk shows that were about krishi, about agriculture or educational matters, and those were typically done by men. But Bela De and Neela Mujumdar, Bela De in particular, is a key figure when it comes to women presenting and actually directing talk shows.
We have another question raised by Tania Roy. Uh, of course, it's a fascinating presentation. I agree with you. She has just raised a question. Would you would like to know if there's any published paper by the speaker on the same? Would like to learn more.
I wish I was as prolific as you think I am. It's in the works. It should be coming out sometime next year in the Journal of Radio and Media, but I can direct you towards, and I'm just going to type it in here. This is called Making Your Program. I think that's the name of it. Indira Bishash is one who is really she's done pioneering work, and she's actually done a lot of work in archiving some of this Beta Jagat, but also sort of, starting to archive the talk shows. So she's someone that you might very well look up because fascinating. And of course, you have, and this is Isabel Alonso's Radio for the Millions. Although she's talking more about that, she has a very significant section on Netaji, um, but she's really talking about music in that section.
Um, Thank you for such a fascinating take on the different aspects of radio, the gendered aspects of it. With your permission, may I just take and read out your prolific bio note to our esteemed audiences?
Of course, thank you.
Dr. Sunayani Bhattacharya is an associate professor in the Department of English at St. Mary's College, California. Her scholarship is at the juncture of comparative literature, post-colonial studies, and archival studies. And she investigates practice of reading and listening as they emerge in colonial and post-colonial texts. Bhattacharya completed her doctoral work in the Department of Comparative Literature in the University of Oregon. She is the co-editor of the interdisciplinary journal 19th Century Studies. Her first book, the novel In 19th Century Bengal, Becoming Readers in Colonial India, challenges the dominant post-colonial scholarship and engages with the lived experience of colonial modernity as it traces the import of Bengali readers' choices on her quotidian life and grants access to 19th century Bengal as a space in which the past is to be found and enmeshed with the present. Bhattacharya's current project, tentatively titled For Your Ears Only, All India Radio and Bengali Popular Prose, argues the radio programs, particularly cricket commentary and talk shows, introduce Bengali audiences to a new mode of narration in which they are trained to comprehend context through the modulation of the presenter's voice. Audiences create a feedback loop by expressing preference for particular presenters such as Birendra Krishna Bhadro and Ajay Bose, whose tonal range comes to influence not only other radio performers but also the content of programs. This exchange is indexed in print magazines and cheap novels, thus creating a media ecosystem within which the early 20th century Bengali readers exists. Such a wonder and such an honor to have you with us, ma'am. We are truly delighted and truly honored. Once again, thank you and we hope to see you very soon.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and good luck with the conference. It sounds fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again.